Resistance is everywhere, but everywhere a surprise. Why? What explains the downright shock among the powerful when confronted by the most human of demands? For life, for freedom, and equality? Any system of domination relies, to some degree at least, on the pretension that those in power deserve to be there, that their rule is by definition legitimate and good, and more often than not, those in power are persuaded by comforting stories they tell themselves. This book is about the kind of hubris that such comforts produce among the powerful and that makes them blind to those who would oppose their rule.
Thank you to Oakley Ciccariello-Maher for that short reading from the opening pages of Anticolonial Eruptions. You're listening to Conversations in Atlantic Theory, a podcast dedicated to books and ideas generated from and about the Atlantic world. In collaboration with the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, these conversations explore the cultural, political, and philosophical traditions of the Atlantic world, ranging from European critical theory to the Black Atlantic to sites of indigenous resistance and self-articulation, as well as the complex geography of thinking between traditions, inside traditions, and from positions of insurgency, critique, and counter-narrative. Today's discussion is with Geo Maher, who teaches in the Department of Political Science at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Geo is the author of numerous articles in academic venues as well as popular and radical political media. He has written 5 books: We Created Chavez, A People's History of the Bolivarian Revolution, and Decolonizing Dialectics, both with Duke University Press. And with Verso, he has published Building the Commune and A World Without Police. We are talking today about his newest book, Anticolonial Eruptions, Racial Hubris and the Cunning of Resistance, which is due out in late March 2022 with the University of California Press. Geo, it's good to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really appreciate you making the time and to see you. We're not recording video, but it's good to see you.
Yes, it's great to see you as well.
So, I wanted to, obviously we're here to talk about your forthcoming book, new book in a month and a half, Anticolonial Eruptions. And I wanted to start out with a really broad question and just really invite you to reflect on the place of this book in your own trajectory as a book writer. I mean, you've written a number of articles, both in popular radical media and academic journals, but when I think about the trajectory of your books, it's really interesting for me to see both the variety of the books and a sense of unity that underlies them. You know, if I think about the We Created Chavez book and the Decolonizing Dialectics book, they're about the possibility of telling different stories about the present, about the future. And in that way, what I would call, they have a kind of classic sense of prophetic, right? The critique of the present for the sake of the future. And they're visionary books. As much as We Created Chavez is a people's history, it's also a people's history that's very much oriented towards the future. And I would say the same about Decolonizing Dialectics. And in Building the Commune in A World Without Police, they're wider audience books in many ways, but they're also alongside the ethical injunctions that I think is a shared value system, clearly, with We Created Chavez and Decolonizing Dialectics. They're really books about concrete steps. So toward that different kind of world. And so I'm curious how you see Anticolonial Eruptions in relationship to those works, because it is conceptual, but it also has real fire to it about contemporary politics. It starts out with an evocation of George Floyd, and that never really leaves the text.
Yeah, no. And I'm glad that you can see the unity in what might seem sort of eccentric, collection of interests and texts. I often see those, the books that I've written as, on the one hand, moving from the theoretical toward the concrete, and on the other hand, moving from the concrete toward the theoretical, but doing so in different degrees with different sort of centers of gravity. Always for me, and this is why I, moved toward theory to begin with, the question was really always one of, the fact that we can't really even grasp the concrete without really interrogating the categories through which we do that, right? Or we misunderstand things, reduce them to simple objects rather than being sort of in motion themselves. I think, in a way, this book is, as you suggest, somewhere in between. On the one hand, it does, make sort of, significant theoretical moves. And on top of that, a lot of the concreteness is also very historical, right? So you're talking about slave rebellions, talking about anti-colonial resistance, in ways that might seem distant from the present. But I think part of the imperative is precisely to, on the one hand, orient ourselves toward that present, and to sort of, gird us a bit for the tasks, required of contemporary politics. Of course, this is a text about, eruptions from the unseen underground, and the fact that these sort of resound and echo in mainstream discourse, what that discourse can tell us, right? When we say that Minneapolis erupted, what is it that is being suggested by the evocation of the volcano? What I argue is that there's something about the hiddenness, about the concealedness of this struggle, about the fact that it's so obvious to many why Minneapolis and the country and the world erupted, and yet so many remain oblivious to that. And I do think that reorientation, on the one hand, of sort of awareness of that blindness, awareness of that tension, and also an insistence that tension offers something to be not optimistic about. I don't think that's the right term, but that allows for an orientation toward the present that is on some level hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, you started to talk there about this, the title, right? Eruptions, which, as you talk through the book, just to pick two, you talk about Césaire's Notebook of Return to the Native Land, as well as the geography of Chiapas, to sort of think about, or to sort of evoke this notion of eruption, right, in terms of figures of geography, figures in poetry, but also for Césaire, of course, that's the landscape of Martinique. But, I would love to hear more about that notion of eruption. Mm-hmm. And it is really interesting, if I could just add this in maybe as a companion frame, that you open with that evocation of George Floyd and the protests after. It does make for me a really interesting case for thinking seriously about colonialism and anti-colonial struggle in the context of the contemporary, racial life of the United States, because I think it's a longstanding question. Can you talk about African Americans as a colonized people? Yeah. That's been a conversation since the 19th century, at least, if not before, in terms of Black thinkers and Black liberation visions and struggles. But I think this notion of eruption is a really interesting way of thinking about that continuity between, say, the settler colonialism of southern Mexico, and if we want to think about that in the Zapatista uprising, or the colonialism and uprisings in the French Caribbean and Césaire's work. And so that, for me, it's always, what are the continuities between these kinds of settler colonial and administration from abroad models of colonialism and the condition of victims of racial violence in the United States. Mm-hmm. So I want to hear you talk a little bit more about this idea of eruption, but also I guess I would add into that. I mean, do you think it helps us think about how colonialism functions in our everyday life in the United States in ways that George Floyd's murder and the protests after really surface?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great questions. The figure of the eruption first, I think, came to my attention by this sort of, haunting, quote from C.L.R. James in the Black Jacobins, which says, the colonists, slept on the edge of Vesuvius and didn't even realize it. It's a reformulation of something that Mirabeau, I think, once said. My question was always, well, why didn't they realize it? What was it that was so concealed? And then sort of beginning to play with this figure of the volcano and to look through references to the volcano, you find that the volcanic eruptions and, sort of broader seismic imagery becomes so central to describing the unthinkability of resistance against slavery, white supremacy and colonial domination. And for reasons that, I'll circle back around to, are very, very similar, right? Shared reasons. And so you have this, like bit in Absalom, where, the narrator is on a Haitian plantation, and it says something like he's overseeing the slaves, of course, but he's sort of underseeing at the same time. He doesn't see what he's overseeing as he undersees the sort of, subterranean resistance that's about to break forth like a volcano and spew sort of hell. And this is incredibly common. You find it across references to anti-colonial resistance, to slave rebellions, so often described as volcanoes, because what those describing it and what those characterizing it are trying to say is that they couldn't see it coming. They're trying to, in a way, reveal their own blindness, and it's a blindness that's racial and colonial, because it has everything to do with the reduction of the objects of white supremacy, slavery, colonialism, to mere objects. And this, of course, this cuts deep into, histories of slavery in the United States, for example, and the question of, are slaves truly happy? Or so if they're happy, why are they revolting and rebelling? And so there's this sort of, this is real, sort of psychic rupture that emerges in slave master consciousness, and this sort of bipolarity that swings wildly back and forth that I track. And so much of it has to do with this question of the underground. Now, what does it tell us, about the unity of these struggles? Because this is very much a book about the unity of global struggles against colonialism and white supremacy. I think, and there's something contextual to this, I guess. I think we're in a moment where on the one hand, struggles are on the agenda, where struggles are occurring jointly every day, where there's, deepening solidarity between Black Lives Matter and migrant movements and Palestinian struggles. And yet we have certain kind of theoretical approaches that want to underline the incommensurability of these struggles. We know that we have, incredibly fraught histories and tensions, across these struggles. But what I want to really underline in this book is the fact that, colonialism as a broader structure of domination is precisely about the generation of non-being, to borrow Fanon's word, right? So you got Fanon and Black Skin, White Masks talking generally about legacies of slavery, generally about white supremacy and anti-Black racism, and describing this as a zone of non-being. But then you have, of course, the same Fanon writing in the context of colonial Algeria just a few years later, honestly, and talking about the ways in which the colonized, disappears into the landscape and into the background. In other words, these are different forms of non-being and non-existence that have different historical contours. We know that, of course, between, U.S. style chattel slavery and the specific legal apparatus, I think that was developed to self-consciously harden, the racial binary. We didn't see the same thing precisely in Canada, say, or in Latin America, of course, where, logics of white supremacy operated very differently. But ultimately, these are grounded on non-existence. Ultimately, when the Zapatistas rise up in 1994 in southern Mexico, they say, listen, we exist, but we don't exist. We do not exist. We are subterranean. We are underground. And of course, they evoke the same language that Fanon evoked, this underground of non-being. And they evoke the same language that the slave masters and the colonizers themselves evoke when they're denouncing these, these moments of rebellion.
Yeah, it makes a really, what you said there for me is really interesting, because it answers one of the questions that I had, right, which is, how do you understand or use this notion of colonialism when historically, of course, there's such a massive difference in the experiences of colonialism, both in the colonizer's imagination of the sort of administration from abroad, where you could negotiate independence, and others where people were going to bleed by the thousands, right? Place, say, of India in the British imagination, or Algeria in the French imagination, and so forth. And so what I hear you saying is that's what binds these different forms of colonialism, whether it's Portuguese colonialism in the 16th century, or, Algeria in the middle of the 20th century, what binds these together is the production of this notion of a zone of non-being.
Yeah, and in part, this is part of the the way that colonialism produces other things, right? It's part of the way that it produces wealth. For Fanon, it's an essential part of that. He said you can't engage in this style of domination without dehumanizing the people involved, right? Without attempting at least to reduce them, and so that's I think part of the process, for him. And again, the modalities of that are incredibly different. Outpost colonialism, settler colonialism, in the way we understand it in the sort of British colony sense, and even myself, I always stumble over the question of, well, of course, Latin America was settled, but it's very different from the contemporary academic framing of what settler colonialism means. It looks very different in the Latin American context as well, because these are all parts of broader histories, right? Because I think this framework, broadly speaking, this framework of non-being is invented in the colonial encounter in the Americas, and then takes on different frames, right? And many of us, I think, know very well the fact that indigenous Americans are formally promoted to the level of humanity in a series of debates within the Spanish Church. At the same time that black slavery is endorsed and upheld, but that of course even today that inhumanity, that non-existence, is still very much the rule of the day when it comes to all Afro-Indigenous, dark-skinned, in the poorest sectors of these societies. Flipping that around, I was always struck by the fact that of course, like living in Philadelphia and looking at the ways in which, the role of violence in the police in slicing up the city and governing its divisions, and its borders and its boundaries, and in fueling sort of primitive accumulation through gentrification. I don't know how I could not have thought of Fanon's description of the colonial world as being a fundamentally divided one. And this is one of those reminders that, we're often told that colonialism on the one hand and anti-Black racism on the other are very different phenomena. But we have so many resources to draw upon, in which, Fanon is a Black and a colonized subject. When he is diagnosing, for example, anti-Blackness, he doesn't extract that from the colonial frame, right? And it's just that there are sort of different moments in his work where he's sort of emphasizing, the different elements, and contours of these dynamics.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And, when you mentioned gentrification and primitive accumulation in Philadelphia, or any city in the United States, clearly, I always encourage my students, or just ask them to take as a thought experiment, instead of saying gentrification, what if we called it ethnic cleansing?
Yeah, or land grab.
It's a destruction of people and cultural roots. For example, the richness of Black Brooklyn, and then the displacement in what we call gentrification, is an ethnic cleansing. Yeah. But I like the way you put that part of the shadow, not even the shadow, but part of the continuity with colonialism there is the production of the ethnos that could be ethnically cleansed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Such that we could even come up with terms like gentrification that slowly become newspaper headlines, right? Rather than Brooklyn ethnically cleansed, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Or call it settler colonial whites in Brooklyn, or some neighborhood in Philadelphia. I mean, I think these vocabularies, the way they conceal, it's really interesting, because part of what I think you've said here, but also comes out so clearly in the book, is that the production of, whether it's the colonizer's consciousness, right? That naivete, that living comfortably on Vesuvius, right? What we might call today white innocence, right? That white innocence is premised precisely on finding ways of driving things underground that eventually explode. And so I think that's why I wanted to hear you talk about, and I'm so glad you talked in the way you did about eruptions, both here and in the book, because I think it gets to that, I don't know if it's a dialectic, but some sort of dynamic interchange around the production of white innocence, but also the possibility of radical uprising.
Yeah, no, certainly. And just having this conversation has me thinking again, and thinking in terms of Philadelphia. And, every once in a while you'll have a situation. I remember a few years ago where a Temple student was walking down the street and a young Black woman hit them in the head with a brick, right? And it's of course an incredibly troubling, and devastating, moment and image, and at the same time, the innocence surrounding that in the narrative, right, is, you're literally colonizing the entirety of North Philadelphia, and you're surprised when little sort of like spurts of lava shoot up and burn you, right?
Yeah.
Like you're literally, or right now there's a struggle over one of the last public housing, spaces in, at the edge of University City. And again, it's presented in a very sanitized way, as you put it, a very innocent way, that they're getting rid of this public housing. It's being bought by developers. That public housing was the product of a negotiated solution to the expulsion of what was known as the Black Bottoms in West Philly, which is now University City. The creation and the building of this huge science center, and the displacement of the entire Black population only a few blocks west into this public housing. And here, I even mentioned in the book, right? Because here, the image of the Black Bottoms is precisely a geographic, and topographic, as it were, image that also speaks to the reality of Black and brown populations being contained to low-lying land, right? Which we know very well from Katrina, which we know very well from so many, other, moments in our sort of climate catastrophe, that these are the communities that suffer the most. And so I think this, this topographic question is also, part of the image. And one other piece when it comes to white innocence is this, and you got me thinking about it by talking about decolonizing dialectics, because part of the story of that book, and these books share some things, even if this one is, I think, less diagnostic and more sort of, exhortative, in a sense, is that, part of what, I'm saying about Hegel in decolonizing dialectics, even though I don't talk about him too much, is that there's a certain presumption of symmetry and smooth reciprocity in Hegel's system of dialectics, when reality is much more one-sided, right? And when you've got this kind of one-sided reality that's unrecognized, what you have is the displacement of an entire mode of, thinking and resistance, but also categories of people to this sort of unseen realm. And so in the same way, I think that Hegel remains innocent and unable to see things even that we know he saw, like the Haitian Revolution, and unable to incorporate them concretely into his thinking of the world and what it would actually mean for his dialectic. Very much in the same way, I think that white innocence plays out with regard to concrete struggles, the shock. And that's part of what I try to document in the book, to say, why is it that when people rise up in Black communities in the U.S. or in impoverished, poor, indigenous communities across the world, what explains the shock, right? Like, these people were poor, these people were suffering and having to, simply, swallow some of the worst living conditions and accept it as their fate, but they didn't. And by doing this very human thing of resisting, and yet you're still shocked about it.
Yeah. Well, I think that transitions in some ways to another question I wanted to ask you. It's a vocabulary question. Which is basically, what is this notion of cunning? Why did you use it? What work do you think it does in the book? I mean, obviously a reader will get that, but I'd love to hear you talk about that. I mean, personally, I remember, it was a number of years ago now, hearing you talk about the cunning of history at a comparative decolonization conference that I co-hosted at Amherst College. Thought it was just a phenomenal reworking of this notion of cunning. So I was thrilled when it popped up in the book to see how, it fit in this larger project, as part of both the historical and conceptual sort of analytic, but also, as you say, the exhortation character or manifesto character of the book. I mean, it strikes me as both conceptually really important notion. It's certainly descriptively really important, but it also has, I for me anyway, as a reader, like it gathers to it a lot of the manifesto character, right? It has a kind of urgency to it, a kind of energy to it that maybe different terms wouldn't have. So I just, in some ways, it's an open question, tell me about your use of cunning, why, how, and to what purposes. But I also just wanted to say, I mean, I find this to be one of the most thrilling parts of the book, is getting this into our vocabulary. Those of us who work on anti-colonial and decolonial thought, I think this is one of the major contributions of the book, aside from, one of the other things I loved, as I said before, the sense of continuity it brings to this notion of colonialism, which I think is a hard thing to articulate. But this notion of cunning, I think, is a really important vocabulary. And so I wanted to give you some space to talk a little bit about that.
No, I appreciate that. And to be clear, this, it wasn't just that chapter, I think, that had its origins in your invitation to that conference. It was the whole book, and I was, trying to think back on what sort of like pattern of firing neurons led me to respond to that invite and say, yes, I'll talk about cunning, and rework Hegel. But for some reason I did, and I'm glad I did, because it really, set this all into motion. So thank you for that, for helping to bring this into the world. In a sense, it's, and when I say, I think there's something methodologically true about the fact that I say I can't remember why. But and what I mean by that is that it was based on an intuition that, that Hegel has this notion of the cunning of history, or the cunning of reason, and that notion is both very illuminating and very real, and also wrong and limited when it comes to the question of colonialism. I say that it was an intuition, right? But it's very much built on what I'd already said in Decolonizing Dialectics, about this one-sidedness, versus reciprocity, and the sort of blind spots that Hegel has. And so in a certain sense, that was a question of reworking the limitations of Hegelian thought around this specific concept, which of course is crucial for Hegel. For Hegel, the cunning of history speaks to the fact that, you see all these sort of wild and irrational things happening in history, that individuals are acting on the basis of a whole bunch of motivations that we can't account for necessarily, that don't seem either rational or that seem rational in the sense of their limited self-interest. But like, he compares it to this process of weaving, where you've got the two pieces of, fabric, one held straight and true, and one weaving chaotically back and forth, and yet they bring together a tapestry, and that tapestry is history. That's what Hegel means by the cunning of history, that behind all of this sort of apparent irrationality, there is some deeper reason. Now, the intuition, of course, is that it's very hard to convince, enslaved and colonized people that there's a deeper reason behind their historical subjection, right? We're talking about, communities that underwent a vast process of, retrogression, that involved, being decimated, destroyed, brutalized. And, in no way would I want to, try to say to those communities that was all part of the greater working of history toward universal freedom. I mean, it's nonsense. When you pull that bit away, then you're talking about, well, what is there, right? What is built into this notion of, of cunning? And when you look at the word historically, it's very interesting, because on the one hand, the word cunning is directly derived from the word for knowledge, right? It's got to do with knowledge. And, very early on, there was a moment in which it wasn't really clear which way the term, would tip, whether it would be good use of knowledge or a bad use of knowledge. Ultimately, cunning becomes a word for a negative use of knowledge, a sort of deceptive, sneaky, sly use of knowledge. Deployment of that knowledge. But again, you have a sort of mainstream history of the concept that in a way sees that shift as slightly arbitrary, or sees it as, just something that happens within the use of the term cunning. But when you look at it historically, you see that split coincides with colonization and racial slavery, right? And so from that point onward, I argue cunning becomes something that is, of course, not always, but very heavily associated with the sneaky use of knowledge by the oppressed and the dominated, right? The ways in which they have a hidden knowledge and deploy it in struggle, in which, and the fact that this evokes a distrust from those who are able to name things in the world, right, and call them cunning, right? They don't call it, of course, they don't call slave resistance and slave rebellions, the fullest expression of knowledge, and human universality, like they call it cunning, right? And that means something strategic as well, right? Which is the fact that, we could on the one hand refuse that name, right? Or we can embrace it, right? And Harriet Jacobs says, of course we're cunning, right? Like we're pushed into a situation that generates a certain kind of resistance that is sort of subterranean, that is not so obvious, that is sneaking around the structures of power, that is sort of in, the frame of like Scott's hidden transcript, right? Using that and taking advantage precisely, and this is what I mean by cunning, taking advantage of the blindness of the dominant, the blindness of the order, using those shadows, using that obscurity as a kind of launching pad for struggle. And again, just to quickly touch on, the way, as you asked, the question of what this means for colonialism as a broader framework for understanding. Indigenous people were understood as cunning, were called cunning. Latin American, poor communities, poor, and darker skinned communities across, the Spanish Empire were called cunning. Black slaves are called cunning. Women are called cunning. Jews are called cunning. And so we're talking about something that coincides at its broadest sense with domination. And here's where I kind of part ways though with Scott, because it's not just about domination. It's about the specificity of a kind of racial domination and colonial domination that then, weighs even more heavily on the word.
Yeah, I think that, as I said in just raising this issue or asking a question, I do think that the introduction of this notion of cunning into our critical vocabulary, and thinking about issues of colonialism, racial violence, racial subjugation, is on the one hand, it's a manifesto book. It's not as short as it seems, I have to say. I looked at it and I was like, oh, it's a short book. And I started reading. I was like, no, this is a very thick read. I don't want to say dense, but very thick read in the sense of making you pause along the way. But if I have to say, as someone who works in a sort of parallel field, right, which is colonialism, anti-colonialism, decolonization on the cultural side rather than the political side, the way this notion of cunning sort of can move across, and as a critical vocabulary, the cultural and the political is really interesting to me because, when I was reading that stuff on cunning, and it came to mind when you gave the talk back at Amherst College, but certainly in the book, and now especially hearing you talk about it, Ellison ends Invisible Man with an evocation of lower frequencies. That whole book is about these multiple ways of thinking about expressive life as forms of cunning, and thinking about that as linked to, as you say, indigenous people in a sort of racial subjugation, exploitation schema, Latin Americans, the poor, Jews, women. I mean, it really, I think in that way is such a promising concept. If that gets lifted out of this book, it's not in the title, but if it gets lifted out of the book, I think this is one of the most exciting contributions it makes. It opens up really new horizons.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad, of course. And the reason it's on the title is for marketing reasons. I'll be clear about that. It was, and I thought, and I myself, I think I'm very sort of, agnostic when it comes to these questions, because I do recognize that the conceptual work around cunning for me is crucial, for you is crucial, but maybe it's not crucial for everyone that I want to read the book. And so one of the questions was how to embed that in a broader, argument with a broader frame. And so, foregrounding the eruption and then bringing in the cunning of that eruption, I think is crucial. And again, the point of that is precisely to speak to, on the one hand, to not shy away from maybe the language of the colonizer insofar as it speaks to a real anxiety and fear, right? It's like, I think our job is not to convince, again, this touches on lots of questions of violence and nonviolence and other things, right? Like our goal is not to convince the system that we are well behaved, or that, specifically those most oppressed by these systems of domination are going to use only the channels offered to them to resist, because that's precisely the point, is that those channels are part of this structure of domination. That's the fundamental point of Fanon's reformulation of Hegel's dialectic, is that an explosion is necessary, and that it is through that explosion, which is not a clean phenomenon and not a a simple one from his subjective perspective, he begins to reconceptualize and reformulate a way forward. But it's also to say ultimately that it is a way forward. And here's, I think, where I part ways with some of the sort of self-styled pessimism of the present, is that, first of all, Fanon was never a pessimist. In the same breath and for the same reasons that he was never an optimist, right? Because he understood the terrain of the world as this constant struggle of the continuous war, against white supremacy and global colonialism and oppression, and that he dedicated his life to doing that, right? Not to decrying it as an impossibility.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And on the matter of the title, I don't think anyone would argue against Anticolonial Eruptions as a title. It's a fantastic title. And as I say, I think when you eruption and cunning together make for this really interesting, the production of white innocence and resistance to that in the eruption, but also cunning as a way of thinking both about the casting of the oppressed, right, as deserving their oppression or being, not being worthy of the sort of the zone of being, but also the way cunning plays out as the possibilities, especially at the cultural level, the possibilities of world making alongside the colonizer. That gets to the cultural question, but on the political question, that runs parallel. I think it illuminates so much.
Yeah, and to get and I don't, you brought up Ellison, and I'm still struggling with the question of Ellison, right? Because I create space for a very sharp critique of Ellison in the book, and the suggestion by Sam Greenlee that Ellison wanted visibility, and I think there's something to that, right? And part of it speaks to the question of sort of forcibly invisibilized people. Of course, there's this idea of struggling for visibility, right? And again, this is cultural code, right? For struggling for citizenship, struggling for rights, struggling for equality within the terms of the existing system. And yet part of what, Greenlee's critique of Ellison seeks to draw out is the strategic use of invisibility, right? I think that's the sort of center of the book, is to say, what if we also, at least, even if not exclusively, think in terms of what advantages are offered by that invisibility? What advantages are offered by, which I think also can be reformulated more broadly as thinking outside and beyond the existing parameters of democracy, of racial capitalism, of what we understand to be equality, which has never been a full equality. And I think has the potential to kind of, in some ways, explode those structures in productive ways.
Yeah, it makes me think a lot about the conditions under which visibility is possible. That's essentially what you're saying. Is as opaque as an essay can be, I think one of the real points of clarity in Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak is, to be heard is to be heard under certain conditions in which you're actually just made invisible again. And I think this notion of eruption is so important, because eruption is not about visibility. It's about literally completely reforming the terrain of the earth. And that for me is, if cunning and eruption could come to take the place in our critical conversations, take the place of visibility, or at least work alongside visibility, I think we would have a much more expansive and volatile, in the productive sense, volatile sense of what struggle means.
And these are absolutely crucial questions for the present, I think, because, and this is a fundamental point that needs to be said over and over again, because of this constant tendency to obscure it, which is that, we're not talking about Black Lives Matter because people asked nicely or lobbied or, elected lower, officials to lower, offices. We're talking about it because of an explosion. And it was in that explosion. This has always seemed so obvious to me. And yet, it's like you're banging your head against a wall, because the entire structure of, the narrative of U.S. life and politics is to prevent this, this argument from holding water, which is that, and it gets right to the irrationality of so-called riots, right? This idea that people are acting irrationally when it's literally the only thing that's ever worked, right?
Mm-hmm.
And working is a complicated thing, right? Because it hasn't worked to suddenly and miraculously create a system of total equality, but it's been the only thing that has created even the slightest bit of visibility, right? And again, maybe we don't want to call that visibility, but it's created leverage, for suddenly the political system responded to the demands of Black people, right? Suddenly, overnight, everyone was talking about it in ways that, they had refused to for decades. And so, again, I think that the critical and concrete purchase of these questions in the present is important.
And is this a sense in which, obviously eruptions reshape the terrain, right? And it's something really interesting, you bring up, it's in the book too, of course, Black Lives Matter. Even just that phrase is an eruption in the United States. It's literally is a 3-word phrase for, I don't even want to say the right wing, but also for the center of white America to evoke fear and loathing and rage, right? And so it is a kind of eruption
and in part,
all by itself, just as a phrase. And then when you add to that riots.
In fundamentally, this is part because, from the perspective of someone like Fanon, right? Like, he might, in his cynical moment, right, respond to that phrase by saying, no, they don't, right? Like by saying, no, actually they don't. But that's actually the critical point of the phrase, right? Is to insist that Black Lives Matter in a context in which we know they're systematically devalued, right? And I think that's right, as you say, the eruptive power of the phrase.
Yeah. I'd say it to my students all the time. We use that phrase in this classroom as if it doesn't overturn the entire world.
Yeah.
But it does.
It absolutely does. And again, to not nerd out about this shit, again, it's like it disrupts the smooth universality of our perception of rights and democracy, right?
Absolutely.
Because, and here again, on a strategic level, I always hate to play defense, right? Like I hate, I don't think we should act as if critical race theory does not disrupt the structures of our world, right? Because it does, right? And I think these apologetics of saying, well, no, it's really not that radical, don't worry about it, I think is a miscalculation. And I think something similar happens with this. As you just described, right? The incorporation of it into, well, no, it doesn't mean that white lives don't matter. Yes, motherfucker, it does. Like, it means that the structure of universality is built around whiteness, and that to say Black Lives Matter is to disrupt that universal plane, right? And to fracture it and to break it. And I think, again, I understand why people play defense when it comes to these things, concretely, strategically. But I think we should also remember that inclusion, incorporation, diversity is always this and must be this sort of radically transformative process, right?
It's got to change the way matter resonates, what it means to matter. And that's the way the phrase itself, I don't know if it's even dialectical, but a kind of almost like a negative dialectics. It arrives from black lives to the term matter.
Mattering.
And all of a sudden it implodes that idea of mattering or explodes, right? Because it's an uprising rather than a down press. But it's an eruption that then what it means to matter is going to be fundamentally different. And, as I know this is a sentiment we share around whiteness, the idea of white lives matter too. It's like the white in that is exactly the conditions that conditions the term matter in a way that, I, you, we, I think people struggle, envisioning something more radical. That idea of mattering can't be tethered to that term white.
Yeah, absolutely. And every time, and that's where I think it's like, it's not that people miss the point, but because I think people intuitively get it when they say white lives matter is a hate, is a hate crime, right? It's, we're onto something, right? We're onto the fact that there is no symmetry between these terms, right? But I think if we take that to the full extent, then we realize that that's the symmetry that underpins so much, of what we think about our world.
Absolutely. Let me ask you, back up for a minute and ask you a question about, what I would just call like the literacy of the book. It's interesting to me, and this is interesting to me about all of your work. I think it's something that marks it as really pretty unique, is the range of citations you have. And in this case, in talking about colonial, anti-colonial, in some ways, I think you've answered this question, but I want to reframe it. In talking about colonialism, anti-colonial struggle, you draw on sources, that range, from contemporary to historical Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm just always curious. I'm curious about this with all authors of articles and books, right? Which is, what's behind those choices? What do those choices illuminate particularly well? And alongside that, I don't know if you sort of go there as a writer, but I'm also wonder sometimes, if after you finish a book and we're all, start thinking about the things we didn't say, are there other sources that you think pull in a different direction? Ellison has come up, the sort of cultural question. But, what's behind your choices in your citations and literacy? And what do you think other kinds of citations might shift in interesting ways the book? Because everyone who reads this book will write after this book, and so write with their own citations.
Yeah. I think it's a good question, and I think there are a lot of pieces involved. One, of course, is that being a short book, there is so much that couldn't be, included. Another is to say that, again, the early sort of intuition / fascination led me to sort of just start looking around, right? On the one hand, drawing from things that I already know and already am familiar with. The idea of this sort of peculiar blindness, for me, actually, the first time I really noticed it was, 15 years ago in Venezuela, living there and working there, and just being struck by the shock with which elites, responded to the resistance from the poor, right? And it really betrayed the fact that very little was expected of the poor, right? When people rose up in 1989, in again something that was described seismically, very much, as a sort of earthquake, as a sacudón, and the shock that then was described as the loss of a world, right? When in reality, and for me, this is the fundamental gesture of a decolonial dialectics, is an outward opening toward what was excluded and invisibilized, right? So if we understand dialectics as a sort of internal rupture within a prevailing order, in which the two sides are kind of bound to each other, here someone like Enrique Dussel adds this piece of where he explicitly brings Marx together with Emmanuel Levinas, to say, well, there's also an opening outward, and that's the really decolonial gesture, right? The opening toward the, unseen, the unthinkable, the unknown, which he doesn't understand in this sort of trans-historical abstract sense, but very concretely as what was unseen by the existing order. That eruption, that occurred in Venezuela, for me, really set the stage for thinking through these kinds of blindness as a systematic phenomenon. But then, there are more, I think, intentional pieces, right? One is the knowledge that I think, my own literacy and my own sort of reference points are often limited to Latin America on the one hand, and the legacies of American slavery on the other. And so I did quite consciously, seek to sort of fill this out and to ensure that there was always a connection with, for example, North American settler colonialism, right? On the one hand, and broader structures of imperialism on the other. And there's a moment where I'm talking about Vietnamese struggles, and which comes up a couple of times, and trying to make sure that these are part of the conversation, because I think they, I think that in varying ways and with varying sort of degrees of complexity and nuance, these relationships and these logics operate, together. So we were talking about innocence, right? The innocence of American troops, landing in Vietnam and then decrying the fact that they're ambushed as if they're the victims. It seems kind of comical, but it's actually what I argue is a fundamental underlying logic of white supremacy that colors even sort of, mass shooters of the present who would say we're under attack and so we need to fight back. And it's, this logic really, I think, underwrites a lot of these, questions. So that's a bit to say, that there's some, working within my existing kind of frames of reference. There were some attempts to stretch those, as well. And from a methodological perspective, I certainly moved beyond a political theory and historical framework to try to think more in terms of cultural reference points, cultural frameworks, film, novels, things that are not always, easy for me to navigate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I always think that when, whether I give a talk or, review of a book, and people are like, what about this? What about this? We can all only read what we can read.
Yeah.
But that's also one of the features of the book I really like, and what I think gives it a really healthy manifesto character is your ability to sort of elliptically point us to subtler colonialism, to resistance in Vietnam, to revolution and war in Vietnam, and so forth. So let me conclude, sort of ask you a sort of final question. One of the things I thought reading the book, and I think this has really come out in your description of it, is I think that Anticolonial Eruptions really brings together everything that you've written. I mean, that from the World Without Police book to the People's History book, and the two books in between, I think it really brings them all together to get them on the same page. Not that they were on different pages, but they had different voices, they're different orientations and aims. I think it really brings them back on the same page. And for all of us who write for a living, I think there's something really envious about having the moment where you get to write something that synthesizes your previous work. And so I really love that this book, I think, functions that way. But you're also not an old man. And so I presume, and not to say, what's next, sort of just as you try to catch a breath from this flurry of writing over the last few years. But I'm curious how, what is after Anticolonial Eruptions for you? What new literacies, what new projects, what new visions, whether it's specific works or just really, what's your orientation as a thinker and writer in these next steps?
I think it's a good question. It's a difficult question. I think it's interesting to hear it described as synthesizing a lot of things, because it's I can see it, right? But it's one of those things I can see it when you say it. It operates sort of between the theoretical and the concrete in a way that is that splits the difference, I think, a lot more than my previous books.
I would agree with that.
Tries to bring the different questions that I've been concerned with together. Of course, A World Without Police reaches toward the global, but is still very much grounded in racial capitalism in the United States. As a way of diagnosing the police. It reworks some of the themes from Decolonizing Dialectics, but again, shifting from a diagnostic frame a little more toward an active frame, right? Toward the setting into motion of those oppositions, and understanding the motion that is already there in the world, in process, right? Which is one of the questions, right? There are things happening around us all the time in struggles, and yet we have ways of neglecting those or undermining them or discrediting them. And so part of it is a question of overcoming certain, tendencies toward immobility in the present, and to embrace that, those struggles and those moments. I think it's important to say that, sort of in an autobiographical way, this book, but also the, A World Without Police, are products of unemployment, are products of being sort of pushed out of academia in ways that were devastating in some ways, but incredibly productive in others. And the main way is, one way is that people are like, how the hell did you write this many books? And I said, well, not having a job helps, gives you some free time. But I think the more important question is, I think, methodological, because it really provided a bit of sort of methodological liberation. And it's not that I was bound, I think, previously to political science, political theory, or the strictures of sort of academia, but suddenly not having those present, and suddenly being able to, think, from a sort of carte blanche view of like, what is it that I want to and need to speak about and write about, was a different experience. I think we all go through this, right? Like, it's like you write a dissertation that's for a small committee of experts, and then suddenly you have to turn into a book. And so you're like, oh, what do I really want to say? And I think this was just a sort of radicalized version of that, that allowed me to, to really, try to think, think through important questions for the present. Where that leaves me, I think, is, is still an open question. Like precariously employed, but still kind of employed now. And trying to dig into some of these questions. I've got some work that I'll be digging into on Du Bois and on Black Reconstruction. But after that, it's really unclear. And I guess the answer is I have no idea. And I want to sort of let the dust settle a little bit, and think a little harder. What I can say, though, is I think that we're moving into, we're already very much in, a cycle of revolt that's global. That's been going on now for 30 to 40 years, depending on how we count it. That's been, very much, palpable in the United States for some 10 years. And that's not going anywhere soon. So I think, anything that I do moving forward will be very much oriented, toward maintaining the unity and the coherence and the sort of like, sharpening of those, of those political struggles.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, we are in this moment of uprising and revolt, and for that reason alone, I would say this book is very much needed, and eyes on it will deepen commitment and insight, and I think breathe a lot of distinctive energy into those struggles. So thank you so much, man. I love the book. I love your work, and it was fantastic to have a chance to talk with you and hear you, narrate, in and out of the book. And I really appreciate your time, man.
No, thank you. It's a great conversation.
All right. Take care.
We live in a time of comrades and cowards, the dividing line between the two becoming starker by the day. All love to the comrades, nothing but scorn for the legions of cowards in academia and beyond, for whom only the inimitable words of Aurora Castillo will suffice. One day, the apolitical intellectuals of our land will be interrogated by the poorest of people. You will have nothing to say. A vulture of silence will eat your guts.